I suppose I am intrigued actually at I know quite a lot of your authors are based in the US, like you both are, but there are authors that are based further abroad as well, or at least grew up elsewhere. And I'm interested in, did you notice anything universal? Did you notice any common themes or anything that that sort of rang true in these papers that have been recognized, not just US based, but around the world, that you found interesting, or that you at least could sort of I don't know, that intrigued you about the papers. I'll hand over to either of you to answer. Sorry.
I'll say one quick thing, just a short thing about Shingu's piece. Shingu wrote a piece on the Japanese on Japanese characters, the Japanese writing system of kanji, and one of the reasons why I was particularly interested in soliciting this piece from Shingu is because in Lacan's Japanese version of the Ikri and the introduction to the Ikri, Lacan talks about kanji, and he talks about the ways that the signifier in Japan impacts the psyche in a slightly different way. And so this gets to the question of universalism. And Lacan seems to be implying there that there isn't a sort of universal relation to the signifier. But Shingu's argument is different. He takes Lacan to task. Lacan seems to be suggesting that the signifier is less repressed in Japanese culture. Shingu disagrees. So it's interesting the way that that text takes up the topic of a sort of universal psyche. And as I said, our effort is to think about the universal impact of race upon the psyche. Not to say that race structures all psyches equally, but it seems to, in our modern culture, structure all psyches to a certain extent.
What your question also makes me think of, as indeed does the Sheldon's comments, is maybe a kind of more meta-theoretical moment for psychoanalytic theory, by which I mean, I think sometimes in doing psychoanalysis, one proceeds almost simultaneously on two fronts, right? So on the one hand, I'm thinking about, questions of diagnosis in the clinic, but I'm also thinking about how one mobilizes certain theories, such as the notion of enjoyment, or racism as a moment of libidinal enjoyment, or racism as the theft of enjoyment. So on the one hand, we have what seems to be almost a template, a kind of theoretical basis, a series of concepts that one can try to apply and utilize. So on the one hand, you could say then that there's this implicit tendency towards a kind of universalism within Lacanian or psychoanalytic theory more generally, which of course it's been criticized for in many instances. It can be useful, and we can start to see, like, for example, how does the signifier function in different social situations? And thinking about one of my chapters on South Africa, you often have this sense of saying, wow, this is exactly white supremacist racism in the South African context of apartheid resembles so powerfully something like Jim Crow racism in the United States. So you have that initial moment, but then, and I think the clinic is instructive in this respect, the more you start doing the work, the more you start doing the fine grain analysis and engagement, you start to realize that the historical differences are also crucial, just as the fine grain detail of what a given analysan brings to the clinic are crucial. So in short then, for me, it's a great challenge to be able to think how to do psychoanalysis both in a kind of theater of theories which can guide us and can enable us to enter into the field, so to speak, and look for certain things, But that work is always counterbalanced by when we start to get that fine-grained historical detail, which starts to tell us different things. And that's also crucial because I think it's a kind of feedback loop whereby one can critique, revise, think reflectively about what might be the limitations of a given theory.
I actually have a question here from the floor, from John, who says, this is returning back to sort of the George Floyd subject that we were talking about earlier. He says, can you relate in Lacanian Principles why George Floyd's murder was the instance that gave the public result? What was different about the public?
I mean, I can have one stab at that question. I mean, it's a kind of impossibly difficult question to answer. But just, you know, I've discussed it with students, and it was a nice forum to get people's ideas. I think one reason why it was such a galvanizing moment is that certainly within the United States, I think it's kind of commonplace that one is aware that this level of racism is apparent. But it's almost like in that moment, if we were to do a kind of Lacanian or maybe slightly Ziziekian thing, what happened was caught and shown, and it was, you could say, the big other could no longer deny what happened there. You know, there's multiple different, and think also about human subjectivity, the way that we constantly disavow, deny, avoid, repress anything that's unpleasant. So there's multiple energies and channels of aversion, of denial of everyday racism and structural racism. But one of the things that I think was so powerful about what happened with George Floyd was there was simply no denying it. And the fact that the big other, as it were, to use that Lacanian talk, recognized it, had a kind of double reverberation effect. It wasn't simply that it wasn't deniable, but that everyone now also knew that the big other had seen this, if you know what I'm saying. And that itself, I think, had a really powerful echoing reverberation in terms of an awareness of contemporary racism, particularly in the US.
I think it's also, you know, the very first chapter in the book is by Todd McGowan, and he talks about racism in relation to knowing versus enjoying. He says racism isn't about knowing, it's about enjoying. So I think this is a moment where people are confronted with the fact of a racism that they already knew existed, but there's also the impossibility of continuing to enjoy in the same way. You know, Lacan talks about the emergence of the gaze as something that shames you. The gaze is the eye that sees you in the act of enjoying. And I think America was caught in the act of enjoying a racism that it had allowed to continue in the same way until this moment. And so there's an emergence of the knowledge, but the knowledge impacts the ability to enjoy. I think that's what shifted.
Thank you. That's extremely interesting from both of you. I have another question in the Q&A from Adrian, who says, thank you very much for the interesting insights. Derek mentioned Lacan's conjunction with Fanon. I would be interested to know if there is an exciting way through the French institutional therapy with Francois Tosquel, you could call him a Marxist Lacanian, at the St. Alban Clinic, where Fanon worked with early Lacanian theories and developed his psychoanalytic practice that later became central in the development of his own theory.
Adrian, I can't see you, but I love you. Thank you for your question. Your pick is in the mail. Okay, I mean, you couldn't have asked a better question. So, I mean, it just so happens I've been trying to read a little bit about this. And I think this is one of those really fascinating moments where, okay, so we get, I've even got the book here. Okay, so here's Antonio Villegas' book, Dead Souls. And in, I think it's 1997, he says, if you're going to do critical race theory, you kind of need to use Lacan, which when he's writing the book, you know, a lot of people in critical race studies maybe don't do that, but he makes this argument. And And one of the things that he says there is he says that, is it not possible that the Lacanian series of concepts makes it a little bit more able to grapple with the political than other forms of psychoanalysis? So we won't go into detail with that, but it's an interesting argument. Could we say that there's certain facets of Lacanian theory that make it, particularly its appreciation and its attention to the big other, the symbolic realm, these kinds of things, that make it more attentive to politics? So that's one thought. Let's leave that one there. What's so useful about Tosquel and what Fanon does, and we now have the psychiatric writings, is that Fanon is involved in a psychiatric experiment in Algeria. And he tries desperately to get a whole series of Muslim men who are suffering, who are in the psychiatric ward, to engage in the life of the hospital. And the whole Tosquel thing is to have practical, engaged situations whereby people come together, stage plays, have a coffee shop, so that it's not quite such an alienating experience as presumably many psychiatric wards are or were. But Fanon keeps on bumping up against this problem. He keeps on getting it wrong. And so what he does, he and a colleague take a trip out into Algeria, and they gather a whole lot of information, and they realize all the ways in which they're getting it wrong. So, for example, you don't go and watch plays, or the group of Muslim men that they were dealing with wouldn't do certain social things in quite the same way. You don't sing in public. I'm getting the details all wrong. But what's important is you could say that they need to do an awful lot of work trying to understand culture and the various cultural rituals, the various modes or genres of interaction, both communicatively and with the social order more generally. In other words, to take that back to a Lacanian thing, you could say that a good Lacanian clinician needs to have a good competence in the various channels of communication, the various media genres through which we engender the big other, through which the symbolic works. And unless you've got a good competence in that, you're not going to be able to engage the subjectivity of the person you're working with. So it's a nice question to ask, because you could say that in this moment when, and Fanon is also very honest about the failures of these first attempts to do this, you could say that there's a nice lesson there for thinking about how Lacanians might want to think about the symbolic order, the various modes of interaction within a symbolic order, and how a greater proficiency of that would be useful to doing meaningful clinical interventions, not just in the one-to-one clinic, but maybe in more communal-based settings.